Hi, my name's Holly Witchey. I'm an art historian, and Larry Johnson asked me to tell you a story. As an art historian, stories are my business, and one of my favorite stories is Apollo and Daphne, the story of the sun god Apollo and his relationship with a nymph named Daphne. Apollo was walking along, presumably through the woods or on a hill somewhere in Greece one day, and he runs across the god Eros. Eros is the little god of love. He's a little Cupid-like figure, looks like a little boy. Well, when Apollo runs across Eros, Eros is working with his bow and his arrows. And Eros has two types of arrows. He's got gold-tipped arrows and lead-tipped arrows. If you're hit by a gold-tipped arrow from Cupid or from Eros, you're going to fall in love with the next person you see. If he hits you with a lead-tipped arrow, the next person you see is the last person you ever want to spend any time with. So basically, Apollo runs into Eros, and Apollo says, "Hey, little man, what are you doing playing with those instruments of war? Those would be better off in my hands or with someone who is strong and able to use them." Well, this pisses Eros off, and Apollo goes on his way, not thinking anything of it, and Eros decides to make Apollo pay. He hits Apollo with a gold-tipped arrow, just as Apollo is going to run into, in the woods, the beautiful nymph Daphne. She's the daughter of a river god. At the same time, he rushes through the forest, Eros does, and hits Daphne with one of these lead-tipped arrows. So she's going to run into Apollo, and she's going to think he's awful. The two meet. Apollo falls in love. Daphne falls out of love and into dislike and flees from this god. She knows that she can't flee from him forever because he's a god and she's just a nymph. And as Apollo is gaining on her, gaining on her, gaining on her, because as she flees, he falls more and more in love with her. As he's gaining on her, in the last minute, she cries aloud for help from her father. And her father, as a father would, turns her into a tree. Now, this is a great story. Artists love it. Her father turns her into a laurel tree, and once she's completely transformed into a laurel tree, Apollo takes some branches and weaves himself a laurel crown, which he wears in her honor. But she's a tree. There's no getting around that. This is a great story for an artist to try to depict. And it's a story that allows an artist to show metamorphosis. So frequently when we see artists dealing with this theme, you see a young, beautiful Apollo and a young, beautiful maiden, and the maiden is sort of running and shrieking, and as she's shrieking, her hands are flying up in the air, and her fingers are turning into laurel leaves, and her toes are growing roots and heading down into the ground. As I said, I've always loved this story. I've loved this story from the first time I read about it in high school. And what I want to talk about just for a few minutes today is the power of narrative to change throughout our lives, to change throughout societies, for stories to mean different things to different people at different times or to different societies at different times. But I just want to talk about it from a personal level. When I was a young high school student, the first time I heard this story, I thought, how cool would that be for someone to love me so much, even though I didn't love him, for a god to love me so much that he would chase after me through the woods and try to catch me. It was kind of exciting. It was like a mythological Harlequin romance. Well, then I went on to college and I was studying art history, but in college I grew a little more self-assured and had a little more confidence in myself. And I started to think to myself, well, that's really not a very good story at all. Daphne, in the story of Apollo and Daphne, is really just an accessory to these three male figures, if you will. Eros is just using her as a way to get back at Apollo. Apollo doesn't even know why he's in love with her. He's just changing after her. And of course, her father, not really knowing what to do, but not wanting to be embarrassed by having his daughter made love to by a god and sort of what shall we say, have his daughter ruined by a god, turns her into a tree. He doesn't ask her if she wants to be turned into a tree. He just turns her into a tree. And I thought, well, that's not really very fair. Let's move on a little bit. I've graduated from college. I've graduated from graduate school. I'm a newlywed. And on my honeymoon in Italy, we go to see Bernini's great Apollo and Daphne in marble, which is one of the sexiest sculptures ever. And all of a sudden you think, oh, maybe that's not so bad. It's about eternal love, and Apollo does take the laurel branches, and Daphne is forever his love, and this symbolism of the laurel. Fast forward a couple more years, I have a small toddler, uh, and I think, when the toddler's being bad, oh, maybe it would not be such a bad thing to be able to turn my toddler into a tree, not for a lifetime, but just for a few minutes. As my son, I have only one son, Nicholas, as Nicholas gets older and he gets into that teenage phase where he talks back a little more than he ought to sometimes, I think, now I really understand. I really would like to turn my son into a tree, and maybe until just after he gets out of the teenage years. Um, but most of the time I love my son and I don't really want to turn him into a tree. And now I find, perhaps it's been this long winter, perhaps it's the fact that I'm getting on a little bit in life. I'm in my late 40s. I was thinking the other day, because I've started, like all of the women in my family, to show some signs of arthritis in my knuckles. My knuckles get inflamed and it's hard to get my wedding ring and my engagement ring over my knuckles. And I was thinking to myself the other day, maybe when I get too old to be really useful, maybe it would be nice to transform into a lovely tree and provide shade for young lovers. Uh, so that's basically the story I wanted to tell you today, and just to have you think about what stories say to you, what they say to you now, what they might say to you in 5 years, what they might say to you in 10 years. And when you think about works of art and when you think about interpretation, know that everybody brings their own sort of life and experiences to a work of art that they're looking at. Hope that's the kind of story you wanted me to tell, Larry, and I hope you all have a great time in this project in Second Life. Bye now.